Good morning everybody. Delighted to be here today and delighted to be meeting Samantha. Welcome to London.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to start first of all by congratulating you really on some really remarkable achievements, from being the first female lieutenant and fighter pilot in the Italian Air Force. And I believe you set the record for the longest space flight. That has since been broken?
It has been,
for a
yes,
woman,
by an amazing woman who is Peggy Whitson, who is up there right now, commander of the International Space Station, on her third long-duration space flight, which means that she will total, I believe, close to 2 years in space by the end of this space flight. Wow. So, amazing lady.
It's a very long time. So, but what makes a good astronaut? I mean, I'm sure there's obviously a lot of technical ability, but there must be a lot of psychological insight as well that goes into their selection of who actually gets to go into space from the space program.
Definitely, especially in the last, I'd say, 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of emphasis, not so much of the type A go-go personalities, but really on men and women who can bring something to the team and not throw the team off balance. It's a lot more valuable in today's space flight to be somebody who can make the team work at its best, than to be somebody who has the best personal achievements. And there's a lot of emphasis on people being able to work for others and make sure that they empower others to work at their best, even more than being like the individual achiever.
And where did it all begin for you? I mean, were you a little girl watching Star Trek or space programs and thinking, when I grow up, I want to be an astronaut? Is that what happened?
Very much so, yes. I was a big Star Trek fan as a child. I was fascinated by the sky. I grew up in a little tiny village in the Italian Alps, where seriously the night sky was very present, very little light pollution. I was fascinated by adventure stories, from Jules Verne, and of course Star Trek was a big part of it. But then of course, I grew up and I developed more mature interests and passions that kind of kept me on that path for science, for technology, for flying. I eventually became an engineer and then a combat pilot. I was not the first combat pilot, female combat pilot in the Italian Air Force, but one of the first ones. And I also liked to live in an international way. I studied abroad in Germany. I did a lot of experiences in different countries, and I think that helps a lot too, because the space program is very, very much an international endeavor. So you really, to be a successful astronaut candidate, you have to show that in your life you've been comfortable living in different cultures and countries.
So when you were it was 2014, when you took off in the Soyuz rocket from Kazakhstan, what was going through your mind?
I'd say it was a moment of peace for me. Astronaut training is quite long. I was selected in 2009, and as you mentioned, I flew in 2014, and most of the time I was in training. Especially towards the end, the pace really picks up. But it's not only the training. I mean, I think the training wasn't necessarily the biggest challenge, but it's to juggle it all, the travel, the media work, the expectations of people, the invitations to your launch. I mean, there is so much going on, and you're at the center of a lot of demands for many people, and all of them are well-meant, and all of them are legitimate, but they really add up, and they kind of consume all your energies. And so I was personally really looking forward to that buffer time before the launch. So you sit in your Soyuz at the top of this rocket about 2.5 hours before launch, and then you strap in, they help you strap in, and then they close this hatch, and they're basically sealed off from the rest of the world, and you can just be in peace waiting for launch. So I was expecting a lot of apprehension, because a rocket launch, of course, is somewhat dangerous. And you never know how it's going to go. You're sitting on top of something which can easily turn into a bomb. But it didn't happen. It was just a very serene, very peaceful moment. And the ascent, of course, was very exciting, just from a physical point of view, the vibration, the accelerations. And then a great relief, of course, when we got to space, which goes pretty fast, about 9 minutes.
9 minutes, wow. 9 minutes. So by the end of this talk, you would have been in space, basically.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. You're on orbit. Then it takes, of course, a little bit longer. It takes about 6 hours until you kind of catch up and rendezvous with the space station. But, the most dangerous part, which is the ascent, is really only 9 minutes.
And then do you dock at the space station? Is that what happens at the International Space Station? And then you meet the other colleagues who are already on board the
Exactly,
station?
yes. you dock, and then you're not quite arrived yet because there's a lot of checks that need to happen. That takes a couple more hours to make sure everything is doesn't leak. You're not losing any atmosphere in space. And then yes, it's kind of nice. I mean, there's like two hatches. There's your hatch and the station's hatch, and you open your hatch, and then on their side they open their hatch. So it's kind of this meeting.
Just like the movies. Just like the movies.
Like
You made some really great videos at the space station. If anybody hasn't seen them on YouTube, I really advise you to look at them because they're just so entertaining, and you're an excellent presenter. And it's all things like you're demonstrating the practicalities really of everyday living on the space station, and answer lots of all the questions that we have of like, how do you wash your hair? How do you eat? How do you cut your nails? And you demonstrate all that really well. What was the kind of most surprising or challenging aspect for you about the sort of just day-to-day living in space?
It surprised me to realize that while I was I think I was well trained, not because of my merit, but because the training community really made sure that I was well trained. It's then completely different to actually learn to live in weightlessness. I mean, weightlessness is the coolest thing, right? I mean, imagine we could switch off gravity here and we would all start to float. I mean, it would be fun. It would be, it's an amazing feeling. Everything is effortless. Everything is light. But it's also a challenge because, when you put down something and then you look around and you turn back, it's probably not there anymore. So you really have to start rethinking your daily gestures and develop over time an awareness. So you kind of go through stages. The first stage is just like you lose everything all the time, very inefficient. Then you get to the stage where you're like crazily attaching things to Velcro
Lots
or
of
to
Velcro
bandages.
stuck everywhere, isn't there? Yeah.
Everywhere, yeah. And that's kind of the second stage, which is somewhat less inefficient. And then you get to the third stage, which is the stage of awareness, where you can just let something float. Because it's going to go away if you're distracted, but if you keep it in your awareness and in the back of your mind and your side view, then if it starts floating away, you will just give it a push and it will come back. So that's kind of like the full stage of awareness.
Okay. What stage is that? How long does that take? A month or so?
That one probably a bit longer.
A bit longer. Okay. Well, you were definitely expert at that on the videos. You do a lot of experiments while you're on the space station. Can you maybe just tell us about one experiment and what the purpose of the experiment was? Is it all about enhancing our sort of space endeavors, or is there actual things that you bring back to Earth with these experiments?
They're very different. I mean, we're talking about a couple of hundreds of experiments in a 6-month period, and some of them certainly are technology demonstrations for future missions. We want to go beyond low Earth orbit. When we're talking about space station now, we're talking about something which is only 400 kilometers away from the Earth's surface, so we're pretty much stuck around Earth. But we want to move beyond. The next stage is probably going to be a habitat in what we call cislunar space, so an orbit around the moon, and then human missions to the surface of the moon, and then eventually one day Mars. So we definitely do some technology development, but a lot of it is really science, and it can be more applied science or more fundamental science, or sometimes a combination of both. Like, for example, I did an Italian experiment which was on blood flow and how the effect of weightlessness, or how weightlessness affects the return of the blood from your brain to the heart, which was in one sense fundamental science. You want to get a better understanding of that physiology, but we also basically demonstrated a very simple operator-independent technique to measure some physiological parameters, and that will hopefully also be applied clinically in the next years.
And so in your lifetime, what do you think will be achieved? If there was a mission to Mars, would you go and live on Mars?
I don't know that I would move to Mars, but I would like to. I would obviously love to participate to a mission to Mars. I don't know if it's going to happen in my, certainly not in my professional life, maybe in my lifetime if I'm lucky enough to live a long life. It's not like we can't go to Mars. Of course we could go to Mars, but right now the economy of it is prohibitive. I mean, it would just cost very much. So I think we need to focus on, I like to focus on things that are achievable in an horizon which is not too far. So right now what I'd like to focus on is, of course, hopefully my next flight to the space station, which is hopefully going to happen in the next decade. But we're also preparing this missions in cislunar space. So right now the international community is really coming together, all the different agencies, to put some meat into this concept to really decide how it's going to look, who is doing what, what is the launch schedule, you know, when do we start manufacturing this, when do we launch it, how are astronaut operations going to look like, how do we keep our astronauts healthy up there, what do we want to achieve, for example, do we want to land rovers on the moon first, do we want astronauts in the cislunar habitat remotely controlling them so we can explore the surface and map the resources before we put humans on the surface of the moon. So that's what I like to focus on, and if I had a chance to participate in something like that, I would already consider myself very fortunate.
Very good. Have we got any questions from the floor? I'm sure. Lady here in the blue dress.
Hi. Over the last day, we've talked a lot about disruption and short-termism and, you know, volatility, and you're talking about decades and 5-year training. And I'm fascinated by how you keep on course with such a long-term horizon in such a disrupted environment.
Yeah, I guess the space business is not the most agile industry in that sense. I mean, we really need to plan long-term, and we really need to stick to the plan. And unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. So sometimes, you know, we have programs that go on for years, and then the conditions change, and then they get defunded, and we have to give them up, and that's, of course, a pity. I mean, you always take away the technology development and the preparatory work, but it doesn't get to the goal, and that happens, and we know that happens. One key element in mitigating that I think at least for the space station program, but I think for future programs as well, is international cooperation. When you lock something in an international agreement between space agencies, or in the past it's been even memorandum of understandings at governmental level, of course that's a little bit more locked in stone than a program which is only financed by one agency, and then it's a little bit at the mercy of election cycles, financing cycles, and stuff like that.
And best thing about being in space?
The best thing about being in space, I don't know if there is one best thing. I mean, you know, that there's just the fact of knowing that you are in space, and you know, sometimes you have to pinch yourself to realize that, you know, you look out of the window and everybody, you know, billions of people are down there on the planet, and it's just you and 5 other people who happen to be out there in space. Just the uniqueness of the situation. The view of the Earth from space is magnificent. The sensation of weightlessness is something, it's just unique and incredibly, I found it incredibly pleasant. The fact of working with, you know, in a very special team where, you know, I found, at least in our crew, there was a lot of harmony, and I guess it comes from people being selected in a certain way and having worked for so many years towards a certain goal, and really having the feeling that the mission is so much more important than anything else, like, you know, personal disagreements and stuff like that. It's so much, you know, for those 6 months, the mission is so much on another level of importance and commitment and investment that you just feel like you're in the zone.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I mean, we could have talked about it for hours, but thank you very much for those insights. And can I say, award for best dressed lady of the day, I think.